Tim was probably right about the moustache. He's a bit of a ghost at the feast, isn't he? The title is as pretentious as Tim's. It was his idea. I'm going to try and go through some thoughts about what we've been discussing yesterday to kind of bridge back to that discussion. And then I really wanted to focus on the sort of culture industry discussion in the post-war period, but I'm going to look at high culture in particular. But I think we might start with some definitional excursion, if you like, into the meaning of culture, then look at some of the problems of the loss of touch with tradition, loss of cultural authority, and then try and bring it up to the modern day and look at some examples of discussions about culture in the form of classical music, literature, and the arts, insofar as we'll have time to do that. We've noted, I think, yesterday that the culture wars are more than the contemporary preoccupation with identity, and that they're more than the countercultural movements of the 1960s. The erosion of the authority of Western cultural values was very much accelerated by the First World War, as Frank was saying yesterday, and as he's detailed in his book on the First World War, and maybe found its clearest articulation in Oswald Spengler's The Decline of the West, the first volume of which was published in 1918. Maybe Spengler's core idea was that culture is a matter of becoming, which then inevitably, in a sort of natural process, turns into being. Being is something static, which will die, which he calls civilization. It's when culture sort of freezes, gets set in its ways, and starts to become old. But Spengler was not the first cultural pessimist, and as Tim was taking us through it yesterday, the end of the 19th century saw a real detachment of the cultural elites from the elites of business and politics. And this weakening of authority is a long-running process that maybe starts with the Reformation and the early beginnings of the process of the secularization of society. Maybe when we start becoming aware of tradition as tradition, and when art stops being sacred. The things start to be put to question. Hegel talks about the way in which the ethical life, the ethical order, is ethical behavior grounded in custom and tradition and developed through habit and imitation in accordance with the objective laws of the community. That's something that becomes the object of self-conscious reflection from the Enlightenment onwards, and we can understand people like Matthew Arnold railing against the barbarism, he calls it, of the aristocracy and the Philistinism of the middle classes, while the Enlightenment had been suffused by classical culture and the beginning of the 19th century had been swept by a mania for all things Greek. By 1900, the classics of the foundation of education had been under attack for at least 2 generations. Nietzsche himself was a classical scholar and philologist of note, but becomes the archetype of 19th century pessimism, decrying culture as a lie, masking the naked power of the elites, the oligarchy, and morality is just a sham. A real sort of attack on tradition, on the values of his civilization. Tim rightly compared it to Heidegger's desire to philosophize with a hammer, the destruction of his attack on metaphysics, but it also takes a form in romantic rebellion of 19th century artists who want to do anything to show how different and original they are, how much they're no longer conforming to the values of society. And already at the beginning of that century, we can read in Hegel's aesthetics that art's pretty much finished. Hegel says, art no longer counts for us as the highest manner in which truth obtains existence for itself. In its highest determination, vocation, and purpose, art is and remains for us a thing of the past. What this long-running culture war really is, I think, is a weakening and a rejection of the authority of traditional cultural judgment. Without any cultural line being held, there's more or less a cultural free-for-all going on now. And as these cultural wars have deepened, we end up with a rejection of the idea of cultural judgment in any form, not just its traditional. Now, culture is a very broad term, of course. I'm going to try and concentrate, as I said, on culture in the sense of works of art, of high culture, because I think it's there you can probably see the effect of the erosion of cultural judgment most clearly. And the arts maybe sometimes seem to prefigure and predict what's going to happen in the future. But what is culture? Well, at the simplest level, it's not nature. Nature just is. Culture is an improvement on what is, or a taking care of what is, attending to it and nurturing of it. Culture is a Roman word. It comes from the Latin verb colere, which means to cultivate, agriculture. It means to look after fields and vegetable gardens in which you work under the Italian sun to produce the necessities of life from nature. So by extension, the verb colere starts to become to mean where you live, the land in which you inhabit, from which you take what you need to live. It's where you dwell. Colere is to persist in a place, to stay somewhere that you've cultivated and thereby made fit for you to live in. Culture is about cultivating and making a world, and also being in the world. It's got a subjective, active sense and also a passive sense. It's about becoming and being. It's also about giving thanks for all of this, for the kind of miracles of nature. And one gives thanks by making sacrifices in the form of cult to the gods. And you can be thankful as well for, after all that hard work in the fields, having a bit of free time at the end of the day, or at least in the good years when the harvest is plentiful and there's a bit of an abundance of olives or whatever it is you live on in ancient Italy. In that free time, you can turn your attention to self-cultivation. You can look after your body, but maybe very quickly start to care for your soul and your spirit. You can become self-cultivating. And at that point, culture tends to inevitably takes on something of a moral dimension. You ask yourself the question, what sort of person do I want to make of myself? And what sort of a person should I be for others? How should I appear to others? How should I be regarded by them as an object of their judgment? Culture essentially then is not natural. We have nature on the one hand, what is given, and culture on the other hand, what we make. In the man-made world, we have both use objects and works of art, and both of these are durable. I'm drawing here from an important essay by Hannah Arendt called The Crisis in Culture, but I'll try and give a kind of précis of her argument. She argues that there are various categories of things that we make. So there are things that we make that we use up, bread, clothes, Mills and Boon's novels, consumer goods. Then there are things that we make that we use to make other things, equipment, hammers, machine tools. Now, they have durability. Good hammers are not used up in the hammering of one nail. And then there are things that we make that are not to be used up, consumed, or nor in fact to be used at all, but things that are made to last. Temples, poems, paintings. Things that aspire to the condition of immortality. And the things that last the longest are those that we can be pretty confident are good. So it's a safe bet often to reckon that the Iliad and the Odyssey are good works of art because many generations of critics have kept them on the list. And that cultural tradition is a sort of accretion and accumulation and aggregation of critical traditional judgments that have persisted through time. Just for completeness, there's a sort of fourth category of things, which is actions and words and events, which don't last at all. They disappear as soon as they happen, except insofar as they're preserved in our memories and our histories. Now, these cultural products make up the world in which we live. And artworks are superior to hammers because they last longer. It makes them the worldliest of all things, not made really for us, but for the world, and deliberately removed from the processes of consumption and usage and isolated away from the sphere of human life necessities. Arendt says, an earthly home becomes a world, in the proper sense of the word, only when the totality of fabricated things is so organized that it can resist the consuming life process of the people dwelling in it and thus outlast them. It's only when survival at the biological level is assured that we can speak of culture, when things can exist free of all functional requirements, then we can start to speak of works of art. Therefore, all discussion of culture sort of has to start with art, because works of art are the only things that are made solely for the purpose of appearance. And appearance is what we judge in terms of beauty. All right, quick, in terms of how judgment works, kind of get dragged into this by trying to define culture. Judgment works by being able to put a distance between ourselves and the object of our judgment. And we get that distance by sort of forgetting ourselves, by being disinterested. When we're freed from that necessity of being really involved in something, you can step back and judge something by its appearance. Okay, you with me so far? Culture, then this world we've created in which we live, comes in two forms. Two kind of conceptions of culture, common culture and high or elite culture. Now, common culture is a matter of the traditions that go to make up a way of life, the customs, the language, the history, rituals, prejudices, and beliefs of a people. It's what makes a people, a nation, what it is. It's its essence. It's how it defines itself as itself. It's what unites the members of society by linking them to its past and its future. It tells us what matters and tells us how to feel, what to say, what to do in certain situations. As the common culture has kind of weakened through history as a way of being together, so has the search for identity taken on more and more of existential importance. High culture, like common culture, has its basis in religion, in providing an ethical vision for human beings seen as objects of judgment. But high culture, on the other hand, is not possessed by all members of a community, but only by those who have taken the effort to cultivate themselves. And the ability, as I said at the beginning, the ability to make that effort depends on having the ability, the leisure, the money, the free time in order to do so. It really depends on freedom. Leisure time is the time in which we are free from all cares and activities necessitated by the life process, and therefore free for the world and its culture. This is the view of culture as being something that will reward those who work at it, a subject who is free to appreciate the beautiful object. All right, so that's the history of aesthetics. And definition of culture in 20 minutes. I'm going to leap all the way back to Homer, just because Homer is better company on Sunday morning than the other H, really, though they're both good to read. Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, standing right at the beginning of the Western cultural tradition, can be read themselves as commenting on what culture actually is. The most frequent activity in both epics is feasting. Certainly in the Odyssey, there's maybe slightly more fighting than feasting in the Iliad, but nevertheless, eating and drinking is a very integral part of both these epic poems. In book 14 of the Odyssey, returning to his homeland Ithaca, Odysseus goes to the house of his swineherd, Eumaeus, who gives him the hospitality which is due to all strangers and beggars. He's disguised as a beggar or a stranger, I can't remember, as a Cretan, I think. Eumaeus goes to the pigsty, chooses 2 young hogs, and has them brought out and slaughtered, then singed and sliced and spitted, When they were roasted, he came and put them before Odysseus, smoking hot, with the spit still through them, and sprinkled white barley groats on top. Lastly, he mixed sweet wine in an ivywood bowl, sat down, facing his guest, and bade him set to. Odysseus eats ravenously until he's full, and then invents some kind of story about his return from Troy, pretending to be this Cretan, and reflects on the importance of meat and wine, and how it's their abundance that allows for storytelling to happen. If only we too had food and sweet wine enough to linger on here inside this cottage and feast undisturbed while other men went about their tasks, then I might well enough spend a 12-month recounting the sorrows of my spirit and still not come to an end of them, all the sorrows that I have toiled through because the gods willed it so. But it's only 5 pages later, actually, that Eumaeus declares it's time for another meal, and calls to his fellow swineherds, "Bring me the best hog you have. I mean to slaughter it for this guest from distant parts. We ourselves shall be gainers too, after suffering toil and trouble so long, for the sake of these white-tusked hogs, while others devour scot-free the creatures that we have labored over." That's the suitors who are eating Odysseus out of house and home. So saying, he turned to splitting firewood with ruthless bronze, while the others brought in a fat 5-year hog and held it by the hearth. The swineherd did not forget the deathless ones, for he was a right-minded man. To begin the sacrifice, he plucked hairs from the beast's head, and as he threw them into the fire, he besought the gods, one and all, that sage Odysseus might return to his own home. Then he raised himself to his full height, and with a billet of oak left unsplit, he struck the hog, and it fell stunned. They cut the throat and singed the carcass, and quickly divided it. Eumaeus took strips from all the limbs, covered the thigh bones with rich fat and with the strips, then sprinkled them with barley meal. There's a bit of a sort of ritual repetition thing that goes on here. The barley meal, threw them into the fire. Then his men cut up the rest, spitted the pieces, roasted them carefully, took them all off again, then heaped them on serving dishes. The swineherd stood up to portion them out justly and fairly, as was his way. He divided the whole into 7 portions, assigning one with the due prayer to the nymphs and to Hermes, child of Maia, and giving the rest to the diners one by one. He honored Odysseus with the whole length of chine from the hog, and with this tribute he cheered his master's heart. Feasts in epic poetry are actually the settings for the performance of epic poetry. It's, you celebrate the fact that you've got enough to eat by making stories, recounting stories in that setting. Things that are rehearsed over many centuries, and they give a real historical continuity. They celebrate the values of equal sharing, mutual obligation, individual esteem within the collective. Odysseus gets a little bit more hog. Potential for, but also the potential for universal inclusion. Just sacrifice is given. People do the right things because they are right-minded people, still living in an enchanted world where tradition isn't tradition, it's just what you do. Well, that was then, if you like. The crisis in culture in Hannah Arendt's essay is that she sees a real sort of tragedy, is that with the emergence of masses of people into leisure time that they'd never had before, as the productive forces of society are kind of raised to that level, people have more free time. The tragedy she sees is that happens almost at exactly the same moment that the cultural elites give up on the cultural tradition of the West and say, look, there's nothing here. It's all rubbish. You might as well be happy with films and Hollywood and mass culture. That'll be fine. There's nothing really else to do. None of this stuff that we've created through the past is worth hanging on to. The things of the moment are more important. She says it's the tragedy of mass man that he comes of age as cultural judgment leaves the stage, leaving him bereft of standards by which to judge, leaving him alone, able only to consume, egocentric and alienated. Now there's this whole discussion post-war about how the culture industry has taken over in terms of Adorno and Horkheimer, but also in terms of Arendt, Raymond Williams, and Heidegger. Lots of people make the point that everything is being used up. In the dialectic of enlightenment, which is Adorno and Horkheimer's book, but also in Adorno's The Culture Industry, the argument is made that instrumental rationality, the absolute power of capitalism, has commodified art, turned all ends into means. Films, radios, and magazines now make a system which is uniform as a whole and in every part. Even the aesthetic activities of political opposites are one in their enthusiastic obedience to the rhythm of the iron system. There's no way out of this totalizing view of consumer culture, mass culture. Everywhere there are the gleaming towers signifying the ingenious planning of international concerns. Artistic rebellion and individual imagination have been crushed. The worker is more robot than man. Bourgeois freedom, nothing but a myth, bought with the exclusion of the lower classes. Adorno and Horkheimer argue that the culture industry is the de-artification or commodification of art by capitalism. It's an inauthentic and formulaic regurgitation of reality that deceives its audiences. The liquidation of tragedy confirms the abolition of the individual. And I like this one, the bourgeois is already virtually a Nazi. Now, I do kind of see this view that all this process development, this long tradition of culturing the world has brought us to a point that we've entrapped ourselves, enframed ourselves, Heidegger would say, that we've turned ourselves into things, that we can only understand ourselves as things among things, that we pay for our increased power over the natural world with an alienation from which is the basis on which we exercise our power. The power principle of the alienated bourgeois leads, as Safransky argues in his biography of Heidegger, to production line murder in the Holocaust. The bourgeois is already virtually a Nazi. Men are leveled off and then finished off for Adorno and Horkheimer, but Heidegger makes a similar argument. Agriculture is now a motorized food industry, essentially the same as the manufacture of corpses and gas chambers. Which brings us to Heidegger. How are we doing for time? Now, I wrote quite a lot about Heidegger, and I've been trying to take the temperature on this in terms of how much people want to hear about it over the course of the weekend, and I'm not quite sure how much we want to go into it. He is quite quotable, I think. Tim to one side. The artist is the origin of the work is the origin of the artist. Seems quite straightforward and clear. We can kind of wrap that one up. He's good at doing definitions. Origin means that from and by which something is what it is and as it is. So that's sorted too. He covers all the ground quite quickly. Heidegger, but I think he writes a number of important essays before and after the war, kind of framing the war. The origin of the work of art in 1935 and the question concerning technology after the war in 1952. The arguments are complex. I think the basic argument or insight, though, is that in the modern period, the work of art has become to be seen, by modern period he means the Enlightenment, really. The work of art is seen as an object produced by and expressive of individual subjectivity. That's both its strength and its weakness. Art, historically for him, grounds history by allowing truth to spring forth. When he talks about the temple at Paestum, that temple first gives to things their look and to humanity their outlook on themselves. Great works of art embody and reinforce a given community's sense of what is and what matters. They articulate and can even reconfigure the historical ontologies undergirding our cultural worlds. He thinks he's a historical view of ontology. Our experience of reality changes over time, and artworks for Heidegger maintain and transform that sense of what is and what matters. Great art is an origin itself, it's a beginning. It's when a push, he says, enters history, and history either starts up or starts again. Really great art fundamentally transforms a historical community's understanding of being. Shakespeare on consciousness, for example, which would be Bloom's argument, would be maybe a Heideggerian view of the importance of the art. And he thinks the basic framework is of a subject-object relation. The work of art is viewed as an object for a subject. He argues in another lecture, The Age of the World Picture, that the artwork becomes an object of lived experience. We have a lively encounter with an artwork, so we need to step out of the sphere of our own subjectivity to encounter this external object, and then come back into our subjectivity with the results of our enlivening experience. And so this comes to count as an expression of human life. We see works of art as themselves expressions of the artistic subject's own life experience, the life experience of the artist. So in this approach, the aesthetic approach, art objects express and intensify human subjects' experiences of life. And, he's sort of right there, but he thinks it's a problem. He thinks it's a problem because we end up split off from the art object. It's over there. And we have lost what he thought was the original Greek, Homeric experience, sort of a pre-cultural experience when we could have a more hands-on relationship with artistic products, use them a bit more like hammers in the everyday, and have a more pragmatic in-between relationship rather than this distancing one where we judge, we see ourselves as this, have this totalizing perspective, almost sort of godlike vision on the object, which enables us to judge, is it good, is it bad? For Heidegger, it's a problem because we don't have totalizing perspective. We have a limited perspective as human beings, and things only come into vision at the expense of other things going out of focus. And he thinks we need to be aware of that all the time, that otherwise we end up being in a trap that we've created for ourselves. And so in that sense, and I think somebody made this point at the end of the discussion yesterday, which I thought was quite right, that Heidegger is sort of interestingly hostile to tradition. He's irked at coming at the end of this process. It's like, why did all these other philosophers have to come first? There's Plato and there's Socrates and there's Cicero and all these people. They've done all this stuff. It's so annoying. Right? I want to just leap back all the way before them, reject all of Western aesthetics, all of Western philosophy, and get back to when things were just right, because we hadn't started thinking about them, and we need to allow them to just be more. So he's sort of rejecting all of the past in favor of an original outlook in the literal sense. He's irritated about having come last in being thrown into a world in which others have come before him. Now, I mention this because it's that irritation, if you like, with what has come before that we can see very much exemplified, I think, and I'm going to leap forward to the contemporary debates now. We can see it very much exemplified in the kind of questioning, uncomfortable relationship we have with Western high culture. So classical music, we can see there's often a kind of a problem. Claire pointed out to me, and I was looking this up yesterday, The Guardian, I don't regularly read The Guardian, so I had to rely on her help, but they ran an editorial at the beginning of the month, of this month, apropos of the start of the proms, in which they asked the question, what is classical music for? Now, The Guardian answered that it's got two purposes today. One is either as an instrument, to be used to drive the homeless away from the streets. They sort of play them in the doors of Burger King or in tube stations to get people to either go away, really irritate them and make them leave, or it can also sort of perversely, I guess if you choose the right music, you can also calm them down so they won't start fights. So you pick, Wagner or, whatever your cup of tea is. So that's one purpose, keep the homeless off the streets. Or two, classical music is for rich people. It's just a way of allowing them conspicuous consumption. It's a sort of way of preening and status display. You can buy expensive tickets for Covent Garden. And they're sort of arguing that Adorno's thesis that it isn't a shame that there's serious music has been commoditized. It's been taken over by a sort of culture industry. And the editorial argues that it's a shame that classical music has been reduced to this. But I think its real point is that it's asking, well, couldn't classical music be so much more than this? They argue classical music programming is missing a chance to expose audiences to the shock of the musically new. The classical music, if it was doing what it should be doing, it would be exposing audiences to the shock of the musically new. Instead, classical music is guilty of continuing to hark back, rejecting innovation. The classical canon, The Guardian regrets, is still mainly made up of the once revolutionary works of Beethoven and other dead white men. Right. So classical music is being sort of put in the court of and found guilty of being classical music. Right. So the problem with it is that it's not shockingly new. And if it could stop being classical music, it would be great. So what is required then, the logic goes, is for classical music to be revolutionary again, to be forward-looking and innovative. And this actually is Heidegger's argument. He thinks there's a possibility to blow this all up with a revolutionary new work of art. He doesn't know how it's going to happen. He thinks the miracle's required, that only a God can save us now. But the same argument is being made by The Guardian. It's also calling for composers of this shocking and new music, which I doubt we could really any longer call classical. It's calling for its composers to be neither dead, nor white, nor male, but to be women. And the first night of the proms was Friday night, and all the commentary I've read in it so far is in terms of the sexual politics of the conductor and the composer both being women of the opening work. That's really what's making the headlines about the proms this year. If you can't be neither dead nor white nor male, you can at least be Stormzy, of course. 2 out of 3 ain't bad after all. Stormzy has been touted by the charity Youth Music as a much-needed replacement for Mozart in school music education. Why, you might ask? Because this charity's done a 4-year study in which the research shows, as the phrase goes, that children who get to listen to grime and hip-hop are less likely to be excluded from school for drug and alcohol use than those poor youths who are forced to listen to Figaro and the Jupiter Symphony, or even the horrors of Eine kleine Nachtmusik. Now, you could say, well, this has got to be just right on the face of it. Fewer children are going to be excluded from education insofar as the schools stop trying to educate them. You know? If school just becomes like home or the street, then you won't get excluded from it. Stormzy really is not education. And just 2 days ago, there's been a flare-up around this, again, this question of classical music. There's a guy called Wayne McGregor, who is a choreographer, who released a compilation album, which was billed by his sort of advertising people as crossing the borders between electronic, ambient, classical, alternative, and modern music. So far, so dreadful, you might think, but surely right in tune with the values of the adversarial culture. It's all about fluidity as a value. It's all about crossing boundaries, being trans. That's what it's about. Sadly, though, McGregor immediately came under fire for, can you guess, for continuing to showcase the pale, male, and stale. Only 2 of the works in the compilation have been composed by women. Composer Hannah Peel tweeted, "Biggest names in modern classical and electronic, makes me feel a bit sick in 2019. And then listed female artists who were not on the record, including FKA Twigs, Gazelle Twin, Poppy Ackroyd, Holly Herndon, and Mira Kellex. If you indulge me just for a minute, I had to look these up. Gazelle Twin is actually a Brighton band whose aim is to defamiliarize the horrors of contemporary British society, reflecting on Brexit, poverty, and xenophobia. They defamiliarize these things through absurdity. Let me read quickly from a review in The Guardian, naturally, of their album Pastoral. "The poor are kicked into the curb like empty Coke cans. Shrill and fractured voices hector that it was much better in my day. The admirably nasty production, turning the thumbscrews on Chicago footwork, battering ram techno, operatic vocals, and sylvan folk, means that not only is Bernholtz preaching to the converted, she's also preaching to an audience who pride themselves on their tolerance for enduring hostility. It might make for a more engaging performance than straightforward listening experience, although Bernholtz's ingenuity does reveal itself. She meshes penny whistle squeals, traditional English song, and Punch and Judy shows into her aggressively latticed rhythms, creating a genuinely foreboding tension between Britain's past and present. By interweaving them, she refuses easy binaries between the benefits of either one. And she makes that the more arresting by suddenly dissolving harsh tones to liquid, yanking the notion of a green and pleasant land firmly out from beneath your feet. I mean, the idea that you need to be defamiliarized and made uncomfortable in your own home is a real trope of a lot of modern art. Mira Kallick's deserved a mention as well. She uses insects, both live and recorded, to make music. She uses wasps like a string quartet. I really am not making this up. She taped wasp song in an anechoic chamber at the Natural Museum of History in Geneva, an anechoic vault, which has no echo in it, which allowed her to source the kind of sounds that human beings are not normally able to pick up. She said she heard amazing things like ants walking or moths coming out of their pulps. This became a performance piece called Nunu, in which she placed live cicadas and crickets in a fish tank on stage with cameras trained on them. Projections were broadcast to the audience on a giant screen. This actually caused some freakouts. One woman listening to the entire show with her eyes closed, in danger of being triggered. And there were people who were concerned about the possibility of insect cruelty. But Kallick had actually hired a handler to make sure the wasps had a heating pad, water, and lettuce. Experiments in living. I mean, it's all good. It's a bit of a diversion mainly, but the discussion about classical music is these exemplify ways in which it has to stop being classical. You can decide whether or not that kind of thing is music, but the cultural war here is that the problem really is seen that classical music is seen as old and white. It has to be transgressed. We need the new. We need the cross-boundary. We need things that are not defined or limited or judged or standardized in any way whatsoever. There's a real rejection of any kind of elitism in the arts. Any kind of claim of cultural authority is immediately undercut because you'll fail to be diverse enough. And it's a kind of process. I've got the best compilation album of, boundary crossing music. No, you haven't. There aren't enough women on it, or there aren't enough da-da-da, and so it unravels. The only possible criterion is relevance. It's the only extent to which anything can be said to be good at all is the extent to which it's good for me, which is the argument of John Carey, actually, in What Good Are the Arts, which is really a manifesto for cultural relativism, in which he argues anything can be a work of art. He's sort of, let's celebrate the fact that traditional authority is gone. Anything could be a work of art. What makes it a work of art is just that someone thinks of it as a work of art. And that someone, he's very explicit, can be just one person and doesn't need to be a person who's arty in any way, knows anything about art. For Carey, the art world has lost all credibility. It's exclusive, it's snobbish, and it's been justly destroyed by the end of deference and the advent of mass art. It's not a separate category of things anymore. Remember the point about Arendt at the beginning. It's not set away from the life process and looked after and appreciated. It's all messed in. There's nothing, there's no separately existing category of works of art somehow more intrinsically valuable than things which are not called works of art, which is to make art all about me. Whereas I think it's not for us at all. I think you should sort of look at it the other way around. You should say, how do we make ourselves better for art, rather than asking, what have you done for me lately, art? Now I'm going to sort of finish there because I've run out of time. But just with a couple of closing thoughts that might start the discussion. I'm arguing that there's this generational problem, if you like. There's the old stuff of the dead white men and their standards, which are rejected in the names of sort of being about me and personal identity. Beauty is particularly disliked in a lot of this discussion. I think because beauty is, again, going back to my definitional beginning, beauty is something that shows us that we belong to our culture and that our culture belongs to us. It's about things fitting in and us fitting into the cultural world we've created. It shows that things are rightly ordered. You could argue, if you were Roger Scruton, that beauty is the foundation of any durable social order. I'm not quite sure I go quite that far, but there's a point there about being able to feel that you're in the right place. Whereas a lot of contemporary art production is about, making you realize that wherever you think you are, it's not a good place to be in, and you shouldn't feel comfortable at all. That we should be trying to demonstrate our estrangement, the extent to which we don't fit in, and that leads to a kind of valuing of the opposite side, valuing the unsettling, maybe not the ugly necessarily, but valuing the unsettling, the new, and the shocking. The problem, and this rejection here is a rejection of popular judgment in favor of expert judgment, if you like. It's a rejection of the accumulated wisdom of the past. Very quick list. There's a bad time of the year every year in the newspapers, which is when the Hay Festival happens, and newspapers start reporting what people are saying at the Hay Festival. This year it was Move Over Dickens, Children Should Read Trainspotting. A list has been drawn up of what children should be reading by children's literature experts, whatever that is. The experts say that children should be reading Trainspotting, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's We Should All Be Feminists, alongside Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale and Everyday Sexism by Laura Bates. There's a whole list, and there are some good things on it. I mean, Pippi Longstocking's on there. That's the one I liked, actually. I'm less keen on We Are All Displaced, My Journey and Stories from Refugee Girls Around the World, edited by Nobel Prize winner Malala Yousafzai. The thing about all these books, and some of them are probably very good, is that they're all sort of brand new. Right? Most of the authors are still alive. I think to get in the canon, you could at least be dead, but then you become something you can criticize properly. No, it's a serious point. I think Harold Bloom makes it. You can't really get into the Western canon until you've died. But in the contemporary imagination, of course, if you're dead, that's the problem. You're bad. So what can we do at the end of this? 2, I think, points on this. 1, you can't take up arbitrary positions in this debate. It doesn't make sense to say, right, I'm upset with WASP's string quartets. I'm going to identify as traditional. I'm only going to listen to classical music. I think that's nonsensical. Right? It's equally nonsensical to do the other thing and say, I'm going to be post-traditional. These are abstract oppositions, not based on any reality. There's no transformative relationship between the traditional and the post-traditional. There's just a rejection of the traditional going on. For there to be a real relationship, it would be between the traditional and the original. You can be original within the concept of a tradition. You innovate within the tradition. But if you've rejected the tradition, you can't be original. You can be new, and you can be new and new and new, and it all just ends up repeating itself. All the modern art, contemporary exhibitions all seem to be about the same kind of thing. There's nothing, and it can be shocking, and it can be disturbing, and it can be unsettling, and it can make you think, but I would argue, strictly speaking, it's not original. 2, we have to, and this is maybe my more conservative point, I think we need to find out if there's a way of sort of re-sacralizing the world, looking at objects of art as worthy of special attention, being looked after, preserved and conserved in museums and taken seriously. Some kind of humility in the face of beauty, acting as if art really matters a lot. Daniel Bell argued that culture is a creation of men, the construction of the world to maintain continuity, to maintain our unanimal life. And we owe a duty to uphold this continuity and to pass it on, to take ourselves seriously, both in our role as receivers of an artistic tradition and our roles as originators within that tradition. And that's maybe a sort of a religious attitude to life, to say, you know, these are serious matters that we can dedicate ourselves to. It's a matter of maybe having natural piety in the face of beauty, trying to see if we can read maybe in the Odyssey or in great works of art or classical music, ways in which we can celebrate the world we have created.
Great, thanks a lot, Angus. Oh, hands already. So Heidegger and the nature of culture and all that didn't seem to put anybody off immediately, which is excellent. Who's going to be doing mic today? Is it great? There's loads I could say, but much more productive to jump out onto the floor. So, Maddie, why don't you just give that mic to the person who's next to you? We'll start there. That mic can go to James on the front of the second block of chairs.
I'd like to go back to right at the beginning. Culture. I'll take issue with you about what culture is. Culture is part and parcel of biology. I mean, the reason that we have facilities to engage in, to exhibit, take part in culture is because it evolved to serve a function, to feed back, to fine-tune and reinforce the very biology that gave rise to it. You can't separate the two. So from a bottom-up perspective, you understand what Marxists and social scientists don't understand, which, yes, the underlying principle is cooperation, but competition is instrumental to that. It's not antithetical to it. This is why Marxists and social scientists get everything wrong. And so you can't start to actually understand any aspect of culture without this bottom-up perspective. If you just do top-down, all you end up with is an ideological hole of mirrors, which is what we heard today.
Great, thanks. So that mic can go back there. But James, I think, has got the mic there.
Yeah, towards the end, you were making the point you couldn't just be traditional or modern. But I don't think you were kind of held to that. Thought most of the talk was the opposite. I think it was kind of traditional. You were making a case against the modern and innovative in favour of the traditional. That seemed to be the weight of it. Maybe I misunderstood. And I don't think it's a sustainable position. I don't think cultural pessimism is a sustainable position. I don't think that well, I mean, it's complicated. You can't really, any of those conversations that get to like what art is or what culture is always seem to me self-defeating. In the same way you can't say what freedom is, because if you define it, then you've already said, you've shut it off, whereas it's a transcendent. You're talking about something that goes beyond what's expected. So if you define it, you've already killed it and made it into the opposite. You know, if you didn't want to be unsettled, you don't listen to Bruckner, don't go and see Pinter, don't read Kafka. These are great artists. I defy you to say otherwise. You know, it can be unsettling, and that can be very productive. And I think, you know, the modernism was without doubt a fabulously creative moment. It was a crisis, but it was very creative, not least because Heidegger himself is a modernist writer, you know, just like Kafka was and Joyce was, and he's a product of that. I mean, I don't want to say he's a product of that age because it's a diminishing thing, but it, you know, that's partly why it's so exciting and good, is because it's you know, it reacts to the tradition in a similar kind of a way. So yeah, so I kind of strongly feel that cultural pessimism, which I feared that you were kind of arguing, is unsustainable.
Thanks. Okay, so that guy's got the mic there. The mic that James had can just be passed along to the lady who's sitting next to him.
Yeah, in much the same vein, really. Sartre wrote a really exciting book in kind of 48, 49, I forget which it was. Is that working or not?
49.
Yeah. Oh, and in it he refers to new poetry, I mean, none of which I've read, as it doesn't really matter. The point is that he's referring to new poetry which is deeply shocking and exciting for him, which is all coming from black poets who were writing from various bits of discontented French colonies. And in a similar way, in that same period, he was writing about abstract sculpture in a really engaging and exciting way. And so this whole thing about being shocking is clearly something which is a reasonable part of great art. And as James has just said, if you go, there's lots of classical music which must have been absolutely shocking when it was first heard. And still today, you kind of think, people celebrate shocking music, which is kind of difficult to follow, but it's not new. You go right back to classical music at its very best, and you can think there are all sorts of very shocking bits. So why is it that you are arguing that the being shocking for its own sake is a problem as part of art?
Great. Okay, so there's a lady that has a microphone. That mic can just work its way back to the gentleman that you're nearest now. Yes, you have the mic.
Hi. Angus, there's a couple of things that I'd like to contest. One is, I suppose, the notion of beauty.
It's directional.
It's directional, that's all right. I think of the horror and beauty in a lot of paintings, like thinking about Bosch and Goya. Think about noise music and avant-garde, of which I find you immensely scornful, I have to say. And not least the contemporary classical artists that you mention, who some of them I've actually sort of worked with as well. And I thought it made me think about this question that reflects a little bit about what's new and about people shocking. When people first heard the Rite of Spring, it caused absolute uproar. It was a shock. People were outraged about it. And I think it's really important, no matter how absurd some of the ideas seem, that people are experimenting. And I also think that some of the art that came out of avant-garde were, as James said, people grappling with the sort of social context of their time. And I think the other sort of division, culture war, that we sometimes feel if we go back to C.P. Snow, Two Cultures, is this one between art and science. And as we're going into a very particular time around future technologies and AI and what it means and robotics, I think there's also this scope for artists and scientists working together and experimenting. And I think that's a really important sort of area for exploration. So my question from that is, just coming back to what is truly original, what would you think of as, and how does that come about?
Okay, so there's a cluster of questions largely on the same theme, so I think it's probably right to give you a chance to respond to that. Just don't speak into it. Don't speak too close to it.
Okay, is that working? No, fair enough. I probably do come across as a bit of a cultural pessimist. I think I'm probably with Hegel on this. I think it probably is finished. So I think the Western cultural tradition did sort of finish, but it can take a long time to finish. And then, to carry on Frank's point yesterday, I think, if the barbarians are inside the gates, the question is, like, how much can you take out before it's time to go? You're not at home anymore when the barbarians are inside the gates. It's a question of how much you can save and take with you. But I'm not pessimistic at all about modernism in a way. I think I entirely agree with the points about modernism. It's just that it comes about, I think you're saying this, James, as a reaction to a crisis. Right? So there is the traditional is seen as traditional, and people say, "Oh, what's good about that then? How are we going to keep things going? What can we do? We need to be new and create new things." And it's fantastically creative. All that period. Got no problem with modernism. I might have a bit of a problem with postmodernism, but definitely not with the modern. I think when somebody, I think your question, you actually kind of got to the answer. What's the problem with shocking for the sake of shocking? Well, I think that's the problem, right? So if shockingness is part of your artwork, that's all right. But if it's all about shocking, then there's a problem. And the problem is that you think there's something wrong with the thoughts and behaviors of the person, of your audience, right? They need to be shocked, épater la bourgeoisie, you know, shock them out of their comfortableness and unsettle them, because you see yourself at odds with the culture and the society in which you live. And this is the whole sort of 19th century modernist approach against the philistinism of the middle classes. So, you know, when Tim was talking yesterday about Flaubert's Madame Bovary, I don't think he was making an endorsement of petit bourgeois provincial attitudes, but he was saying that there's kind of a disgust being evinced for the way people live, most people live in society. And the artist is separating himself away from that and putting it to the question. And you end up, I think, with this kind of conceptualization in which art is used as a sort of a struggle for social status against the old aristocracy in the 19th century. And you start to see the world of work as being what's real, and the world of culture as being the spiritual thing over here, right? And then it follows that, you know, the world of work, the real world, is sort of untrue and ugly if culture is spiritual and over here. The product of that is 19th century kitsch. You know, you try and create chocolate box pictures of the world because the real thing's ugly. And you have the artists as well setting themselves against the sort of Philistines in society, but also against the uncultured men of business. So the artist, you know, projects both the cultured Philistine, as Arnold would say, but also the barbaric man of business. This is the heart of modernism. It's this kind of authentic revolt against the society in which you live. It sees the artist as an originating genius, distant, as a rebellious, free spirit. And that does provoke a marvelously productive kind of period, which then runs out. I think my argument is that it runs out. And it hasn't been replaced with anything. I'm not sure it can be easily kind of replaced when you come to the end of something. Maybe that's pessimism, maybe it's realism. I'm not sure, but I think that when art, as I said, ends up being for no other purpose than to disturb its audiences, and that's its measure of success, that happens because there's an absence of standards by which to judge things as being beautiful or not. And it's the absence of standards that I'm lamenting.
Great. Okay, plenty more hands. Okay, so there's the gentleman that has the mic. There's a mic on this side somewhere, which, why don't you just give it to whoever's nearest you? Yeah, that's a good idea.
Hello, my name's Benjamin Confino.
If you point the mic more at your mouth.
Is this better?
Yes.
Okay, my name's Benjamin Confino, and a while back on my Facebook feed, I saw a whole lot of my friends going to a very traditional-looking classical music concert. The whole orchestra all in suit and ties, playing music from a video game series called Final Fantasy. And I just want to bring this up because I feel that computer games offer a rather unique angle to all the modern culture war, where you will see people younger than me, so early 20s, going to a full classical music concert quite eagerly, and it's something we shouldn't ignore. Also, I'd like to add just a lovely quote that's second to my other point, which is that it's all art, but it's not all good art. Thank you.
Great. Okay, take those three. There's a cluster of three people there. The person who's got the mic can speak, and then pass it to Ella at the end. Yeah. Yeah, if you have the mic, speak.
Okay. Thank you. First of all, delighted to hear you mention Pippi Longstocking, which I have been teaching very successfully to classes of young Bengali kids, most of whom are boys, and they thoroughly identify with this 10-year-old Swedish girl with red hair. That's an argument I have in education circles. What I wanted to say here, there's a very, I think it's Bantock, who contrasts Renaissance art in terms of how it was produced with the 19th century romantics. And he makes the point that then when you had like the guild system, all this fantastic Renaissance art was produced, although that we come to associate it with great geniuses, its actual production was much more collective, and it was there was a more organic relationship with other strata in society that kind of altered in the 19th century. So there's that kind of aspect to the relationship between the art and the rest of society. It can be a productive thing as well as something to be insulated against. And I guess that would have to be worked out in each specific period you were talking about. The question I had, though, Angus, was this idea of beauty being a feeling of at home in your house. I mean, I agree with the points made earlier about also shock and challenge being part of it, and also your response to it, which is that if it's just for its own sake, it becomes a bit meaningless. But what I wanted to put to you was, being a traditionalist, Keats's quote about beauty is truth and truth is beauty. That is all you need to know. And then that brings you, if that is true, if we accept that, then we have to ask, is it necessarily the case that all cultures, at all times, truth is a desirable good? Could it be, like Ernest Gellner suggests, that truth is quite, is beholden to nothing, and therefore it's not beholden to any ruling class or any strata? So we can't take it for granted that every society is going to appreciate, value, and want truth, whether that's truthful knowledge or truthful art.
Okay, so there's that gentleman with the mic, yeah.
Okay, classical music, I think of it as two traditions. One is the performing tradition, which is hanging on in there. Musicians get a lot out of performing classical music. People get a lot out of listening to it. Then there's the compositional tradition, which I think is dead, has been for some time. And because it's run out of whatever was driving it is gone, and it's run out of things to say. And I don't think that can easily be contrived, a revival of that. And when people try to compose classical music nowadays, it comes out as pastiche. But yet people keep, being creative. And at the moment, they're doing that in lots of odd ways. And there's a lot of good stuff happening out there, like people have said. It's almost like they're starting to create a new tradition, but I'm not sure whether they're going to get there or not. A lot of it is very alienated and pessimistic, as you say. But there's some stuff happening. And the question for Angus is, I agree, I think, generally with you on judgment, but sometimes when people are trying something genuinely new, do you not have to sort of suspend judgment, sit back for a minute, just for a minute, and give them a chance to do what they're doing and figure out what it is they're doing?
Okay, great. Ella has the mic.
I just wanted to bring us back to the very helpful the very helpful place in which Angus started by using the word cultivate. Because it seems to me, while you wouldn't want to be pessimistic about modern art for not being disingenuous about it, part of the problem is that it sort of rejects that word cultivate. So in its rejection of the past, disassociation for anything that came before it as being, as Angus said, dead white male and whatever. There's nothing to cultivate. They're not cultivating anything. And in their rejection of any ability for you to criticise them due to the political nature of it, because it's a woman or a person of colour or whatever, there's no cultivation of their art. So you're kind of very incredibly static. And then thirdly, it doesn't ask you to cultivate yourself in the process of experiencing the art, because the difference between something like a Stormzy track it's very obvious. It's very obvious what the message is. It's very in your face. That's why people love it so much, because it's seen as being easy for young people to access or relate to, as different from a piece of classical art, which actually takes an enormous amount of you cultivating your intellect to be able to access it. It's fascinating, just as a side note, someone like Stormzy, or that kind of genre which came from grime, which was meant to be a subculture, was meant to be a rejection of high culture, to then, be subsumed onto the Glastonbury main stage, the most pinnacle of kind of bourgeois culture and acceptance of that. It seems to me you would be trying to move away from that. So is it just the loss of this ability to cultivate that is the problem? Not kind of poo-pooing modern art, but it's that it does not allow you to move with it.
Okay, so that mic should come forward to these people there. There's this gentleman with the mic.
So I remember Roger McGough coming into my school, the Liverpool poets, in the late '60s, and him saying that you really didn't need to learn things in order to make good poetry. That you just write poetry, drawing on what is all around you. And reflecting on that of late, it's breathtaking that a man that was able to draw on such a sophisticated education and the culture that was available to him, to say that to parochial, uneducated people. So I think there's a kind of conceit that goes on in this, where people present themselves in the form of a popular way, when actually they're not acknowledging what they draw on. But I think that, I suppose what I want to say is that in the course of, so sure, people might start out with a fairly trivial driver for what they're trying to achieve, but in the course of trying to make art and culture, then you're almost forced to draw on things that are kind of draw on the traditions of the past and draw on what is complex. So you take Trout Mask Replica, right? Captain Beefheart, unlistenable, when it was produced, and yet, when you kind of engage with that piece of work, 50 years on, people are still trying to work out what's the complexity of the rhythms that are at play in that piece of music. I think that's an example of how you're kind of sure it may be that was the kind of post-68 moment, and it was all about the kind of rejection of everything, but then in the course of engaging with it, you end up having to become a really sophisticated musician, or understand that piece of work, drawing on that kind of sophistication. And I even think that's true of Stormzy. I mean, surely it's the case that, like The Lion King, when you watch Stormzy's performance, it's the kind of best that there is available. There's a whole kind of industry around him, which is kind of involved in the curation of his performance. And I'm sure that as he develops his work, he too will be drawing on centuries of tradition.
I just wanted to talk about the theatre. One thing that has happened just recently, which has really upset me, is I love the play Cathy Come Home, written in the 60s, and I think it's a classic. Recently, a local drama club have decided to do Cathy, which is a new version about austerity, and Cathy's 43 and her teenage daughter, she's got a teenage daughter, and she's chucked out of her house, and she goes through this process where she has to go and see the homeless people and all of this sort of stuff. Anyway, it's so dull. But the thing about this play is at the interval, the play finishes at the interval, and then in the second half, the audience then decide what happens in the play. So the audience are then rewriting the play in the second half, and when I heard about this, I nearly puked. But that was the thing that struck me. When you said the thing about, culture used to be about the beauty and the perfect world, and, we live in the real world, and culture was about creating this sort of ideal of what good things can be, about beauty. In the theatre now, everything is about making it real. So you can't play, I wouldn't be able to play a black character or a character that comes from Africa as a white woman, because even though I might be a good actor, I'm not real. And it has got to the point now where they will put casting calls out for trans people, not for actors anymore, for people who are trans. And I just wondered whether this was representative of part of this process, that actually now, in theatre, when you're writing new plays, it has to be real. It has to involve what people think now, as opposed to being something that's challenging, that you have to work at. We were just talking about Emma Rice at the Globe, and she said that she finds the Globe, Michelle Terry, she finds the Globe a feminine space, and she was disempowered as an actor at one point before she came to the Globe. We were both saying that she was disempowered before because she didn't get the roles she wanted. Now that she's in the Globe, her company can allow her to play Hamlet and have all the roles she wanted. So it wasn't a disempowerment because she's a woman, it was a disempowerment because she wasn't in charge of who got cast.
Yeah, I think there's some interesting points there. I think we could, I hope we could probably agree that the culture wars playing out in terms of the sort of sexual identity politics, using the arts as a battleground, is not necessarily going to be good for the arts. So, you know, celebrating the first night of the Proms because it's about more female composers has to be at the expense of paying attention to the music. Right? So I just think, I hope we could agree on that kind of point, that it'd be good to keep identity politics out of the arts. But the harder question, I think, that's, for me anyway, that's coming up here is about the, you know, the value of the new. You know, isn't Stormzy great? After, you know, centuries of Stormzy, there'll be a Stormzy tradition, and so on. And Captain Beefheart, if you spend enough time, you can really get into it. Yes, you can, probably. I'm not sure I've got enough time, and I think Wagner's better, right? Which is not just my judgment. It may not be objectively true, but I probably come from a school of aesthetics that think, you know, that it's got a better chance of standing up in the test of time than Stormzy has. Now, of course, I could be wrong, right? Centuries of tradition could prove me wrong. If we think it might continue, I could be proved wrong. That's the value of people making cultured judgments, sophisticated critiques of artistic production over time and building up that body of subjective judgment into something that's more than just the personal tastes of an individual, which won't be around that long. That's what, you know, the value of a cultural tradition is. So the problem that a number of the questions are kind of working around, saying, isn't new stuff good? It's a bit early to tell, right? That's the problem. So the newest thing that comes, the new kid on the block, to my mind, we don't know if he's any good yet. He hasn't been around the block long enough for us to tell. But that question is being evaded in all of this discussion. It's the newness itself that is posited as being a value. But as Frank said yesterday, I don't think there is any depth to these values. Newness is not about, it doesn't make something good. If it did, it is immediately going to be surpassed by the newer thing, right? You're going to be straight on to the next one, and you'll have forgotten about yesterday's fad because that's all it would have been. It hasn't had time to last, hasn't been around long enough for you to make a cultural judgment. Somebody made that the point for me, actually. Why can't we suspend our judgment when it comes to the new? It's the last thing we should be doing. Right? When it's cultural production, we should be using our judgment more rather than suspending it because it's new. And all these values that are being wrapped around contemporary cultural production, it's new, it's female, it's diverse, it's fluid. All of them lack depth. They're not values at all. They don't help us judge cultural products.
Okay, great. Okay. People here are going to have to begin to become a little bit succinct, but we're going to start a couple at the back. There's a mic that's going to be down here, but we'll start with a couple at the back. But we're going to have to be quick to get everyone in.
Well, my question is really about how much is a question of the intellectual discussion and the cultural moment of what's happened versus the actual creation of the art form, and how much one informs the other in terms of this, in terms of Heidegger and your whole presentation. Because you say you may not know it until time, but I think people knew it with Mozart, and as it happens, you know, Schumann and Brahms and others, you could see at different junctures, people immediately recognized someone that was great and phenomenal, even though they stood on the shoulders of giants. So you got this, and we talk about...
He did die in a pauper's grave, Alan.
Indeed. Indeed. Well, but the thing, I suppose my point is that we talk about the classical canon, and it's a range of different moments historically that are all amalgamated. And I guess what my question is to what extent, I mean, this discussion of the new and pessimism, is your view that our intellectual denigration of the past, our inability to respect tradition and culture and excellence and quality, does that necessarily mean that we will be eviscerated by our own barbarianism? Does it mean that the human spirit, the attempt to engage with beauty or something better or transformative, is negated forever? Or is there something that's so special about humans and humanity that we will continue to strive, even if we don't say stand on the shoulders of giants, even if we're saying Stormzy is like Dylan Thomas or even like Shakespeare?
Okay, great. You can pass that mic to Frank next to you. You got it from the front.
Yeah, I mean, I think when it comes to art and culture, it's not being pessimistic or optimistic. The problem that we're confronted with is not...
Could you just turn the mic, Frank, could you just turn the mic towards your mouth a bit?
Yeah, the problem that we're confronted with is not what an artist tries to do, whether they try to be new or original. Because I think there are many, many motives that artists have when they begin to create. It's how we judge what's being created. I think that's the key thing. And I think what the problem that we're confronted with today is that we're not prepared to see art in its own terms. Just as we're not prepared to see culture within its own terms. And one of the points I tried to explain yesterday is that the more we talk about culture, and the more we expand the meaning of culture, the more it becomes emptied of its meaning. So you can see this very, very clearly with art today, where art is judged in accordance with matters that are entirely external to it. When you look at the mission statements of museums or the mission statements of various curators, they will tell you the aim of this project is to increase the participation of people within that community. It's to help the project of inclusion. Some museums argue that their art is designed to make people have a healthy life. You know, it's almost like a public health sort of project that what it becomes. And what we're losing sight of when we're looking at art is that it's, you know, in a sense, it's got to be judged all the time in accordance with the arts of law. I think one of the most interesting and one of the best little things that's written on this subject is surprisingly by Leon Trotsky on his little pamphlet on literature and art, where he criticizes the idea of there being a proletarian art, where there being an art that is, today we would call that the art of relevance, an art that will mobilize people, because what he's really getting at is that once you politicize art, what you're doing is you're crossing a line, a very important line between art and matters that pertain to the political domain or pertain to other domain of human experience. And the tragedy today is, and this is why, you know, whether it's the proms or anything else, the problem is not the music that people create, because it may well be the case that angry people who want to be relevant, you know, who want to make a statement, might inadvertently produce really good art. I mean, that has happened. I mean, the relationship between what you set out to do as an artist and the outcome is not absolutely clear. You know, it may well be the case that despite your intentions, you actually end up making a statement that's the very opposite to what you wanted to do. And if you look at high church art of the medieval era or the early Renaissance, they are all fanatically Christian, and, you know, and they have obsessive paintings about the Madonna and everything else. But when you look in the painting itself, you see humanity coming through and struggling, and humanist aspirations are breaking through that kind of religious form despite the intentions of all the people that are doing that. So, you know, what we're seeing here all the time is art cannot be destroyed, art cannot be banished. There's always art as long as human beings are around. But the tragedy today is we're trying to destroy that enterprise by destroying the boundary that separates art and culture from the other domains of our everyday life. And that's why I think, in many respects, all the aesthetic writings from the Frankfurt School people all the way to Heidegger and everything else, they too fall into this trap, in a sense, by almost, you know, sort of, although they talk about art as this being very separate domain, the way they philosophize about it is actually ends up doing the same thing what the critics do, which is they kind of subject their philosophy, their philosophical kind of principles into it, and thereby they too create a process whereby culture itself becomes a terrain for political battles rather than for aesthetic judgment.
Okay, so that guy just has had his hand up for a while. There's this gentleman up front. No, you, Luke.
Thanks, it's Toby Marshall. I thought that was interesting what Frank was saying, because we've got a parallel between that and education. People really struggle to see education as a thing in itself, in its own terms, and that's one of the major problems we confront in that area of discussion. Angus, I really liked your presentation. I found it very useful. But I wondered whether it was a bit defensive. I wondered whether you were assuming your own defeat in the argument, and it's got a sort of citadel quality, you know, draw up hide up the ramparts rather than get out there and get stuck in. So maybe just to pull it out a little bit, could you characterise your position on the relationship between tradition and democracy? Because you opened with a presentation on the forms of authority, and you know, within that, you know, we've got 1642, 1789. There's a democratic challenge to tradition, which could be seen as a positive challenge, as something that enables authority to be, and tradition to be recast on a higher form, on a more rational form, in response to a democratic challenge. So I'm just wondering, is it all downhill from Newton onwards?
Okay, great. Now, Luke at the front.
Yeah, a lot of what I was going to say has been said before, but I wonder if what's replaced modernism is is the valorisation of voice, which you see in a lot of cultural discussions. So the desperate seeking out of new voices, and I suppose Stormzy is part of that in a sense. I mean, Stormzy is not culture in any real sense of the word. He hasn't cultivated anything, but he's often talked about as kind of a correspondent from a particular area of society, and there is something which is quite disturbing about that in reality. It's a sense that culture has been replaced by the individual self-expression. And I wonder if, when we're asking the question as to what modernism's legacy is, maybe there's something in the idea that it resolves into individual expression being the highest possible aspiration for the artistic endeavour. I mean, it's worth remembering that the Iliad is an act of collective remembrance. You know, it's an attempt to collate and remember the values, the traditions of a people. And I think the question we face now is, how does a society receive and create culture when we are engaged in an act of mass forgetting? And I think perhaps what you do end up with is Stormzy being confused with culture, i.e. the individual self-expression, the correspondent from a particular area of society, being confused with culture.
Great, thanks. Okay, so Claire at the back. This microphone is going to go... This lady was waiting a while, I think. So, Claire.
I was trying to reflect on this new and innovative, and I think one of the things that Angus is trying to explain, but see if this is right, which is, even in order to be new, revolutionary or innovative and create a new tradition, one does that within a tradition, or at least acknowledging a tradition. I went to see Othello Remixed, a youth theatre project created to counter gang warfare. I was slightly pessimistic. It was absolutely brilliant and new and innovative. It brought Nando's into Shakespeare, because it was actually intelligently interpreted within a tradition that didn't show contempt for that tradition, and it was a wonderful piece of theatre that helped me both understand Shakespeare and contemporary society, whatever, right? So I hate the idea that you kind of can only have the old canon and you can't be new, but it does seem you have to be within the tradition or you're not original. And those people who are new and have no knowledge of or contemporary tradition are actually only repeating what's gone before badly, because they don't even know what they're reacting against. But my question to Angus, I don't mean personally when I say, how do we cultivate ourselves? I don't want to lecture on what I should go and see. But I think that there is this problem, which is the nature of cultivating oneself surely does require some experts, or at least the cultural elites, giving us some sense of direction. But as Arendt says, the cultural elites are the ones who've given up. So if I look to the classical music world experts for direction as to what I should listen to within tradition, even if I reject it, they despise and hate classical music, and actually I will be decultivated. I won't be cultivated at all. So where do the masses go? That's a kind of serious question, because in that sense I do become pessimistic when the people who might be able to help cultivate us, or our own self-cultivation, have given up on judgment, and that and have become disenchanted. So that seems to me to be the real crisis today.
Okay, so there's this. Is anyone going to absolutely explode if they don't manage to make their points? Otherwise, we're really going to have to leave it there. No. Okay, this lady at the front, then we're going to have to just wrap it up.
I do like modern art, or some of it, and I did appreciate the black square painted in 1914 in Russia. A while ago, I went to the Turner Contemporary, where they had the pile of bricks, which the Tate got into trouble for buying. And before I went there, they had a video by the artist, and he explained exactly what it was all about. And so there was a pile of bricks and some tiles on the floor. And I listened to this very carefully and thought, now I know, I understand. And I went into the gallery and I thought, it's a pile of bricks. So I wonder if it is a case of the emperor's new clothes sometimes.
Great, thanks. Okay, there's just a couple of minutes for Angus to wrap up.
Way too much to come back on, really. I mean, I do apologise for any sort of cheap shots at the expense of Gazelle Twin, but I just want to use them to exemplify, I think, the difficulties of making cultural judgment. I kind of like the point about mass forgetting that Luke's making at the front, because, and it resonates with Josephine's point about performance and involvement, audience participation, which is a real thing in theatre. Lots and lots of contemporary theatre productions have the artists involved. I mean, there's just been a court case, actually, because somebody threw a staged grenade at somebody's face rather over-enthusiastically in a theatre performance and broke somebody's lip and teeth. Got a bit carried away, sort of amateur actor, taking it a bit too real. But everything is about involving the audience because that's meant to have some kind of positive effect on them and transform them and maybe stop them being, like those youths at school who are going to otherwise take drugs if they aren't saved by art. Or art's always been taken out into doctors' waiting surgeries to calm people down, and it's always travelling around. Which is still part of this commodity view of art. They're things to be taken out and do things to people with, rather than things to be appreciated by people. And I think that instrumentalization of the arts is a problem. It's also a problem, this performance thing, is it just doesn't last. Right? A lot of contemporary art is not made to last. It's either the performance or the video, or it's made out of materials which are not themselves durable. They're just not going to be around very much longer. The Andy Warhols and the Rothkos aren't going to make it through the next 100 years. And that's a problem. They're not set out to be things that are going to stay. There's some questions around grounds for optimism, or not. And I think, that's a difficult question. There might be some room for optimism in the fact that we're now having this sort of discussion, I think more. The erosion of cultural authority has become sort of a thing that can't be dodged. We're involving ourselves in a discussion, and we're not the only ones to be conscious of it as a problem. We haven't given a name to it yet, and that should be our aspiration, to really kind of nail this thing in language. But we are starting to talk about it. That might be room for optimism. Arendt's challenge, I think, is still on the table that Claire was talking about. It's a real problem. How do we preserve the past? And how do we preserve what we consider valuable without the help of tradition? Right? How can you be traditional in a non-traditional world? And I think that's the problem that education suffers from very much as well. But again, to the extent that we can think about it, that's a good thing. I'll finish with an example or a provocation to take into coffee, which is the question whether to restore or innovate that is posed by the fire in Notre Dame. And so I'm not going to really comment on this, but just kind of remind you of the discussion that's going on in France about whether or not what most French people want to do is to put it back to the way it was and restore it to its former glory before the fire. Macron, as president of a startup nation, which is what he likes to call France, which is reinventing itself in the form of a sort of tech business, I guess, wants to rebuild it so it's even more beautiful than it was before, and it will demonstrate within only 5 years, the French are a nation of builders. We have so much to rebuild, he says. And it's become a culture war right away within France between this modernizing startup nation view of the young, innovative Macron and the old fuddy-duddies, apparently, on the other side, who want to restore things. Some people, architects, professors, citizens, are writing in saying, could we not rush into this? Could we just spend maybe those 5 years thinking about what we should do rather than immediately decide that we've got time to set an ambitious deadline for what we're going to do? But their letters and concern has not had much of an impact on Macron, who has already approved an international contest for innovative architectural designs to be submitted.
Okay, great. Just before...